Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last part of our chapter on Europe. This is going to be kind of a short-ish week, so you're going to watch this one lecture, a short video about the UK voting to leave the European Union, and then you have one short exercise on that video, your first exam, and then your country journal like normal. So this is going to be a pretty short lecture. You've got lots to study for this week, so we'll get this out of the way. So this week's lecture is mainly focused on Europe's economic geography. It is the most developed region we will study in this class. Um, it has more economic integration here than any other region. So the countries in Europe are really economically tied together quite tightly. The EU, which is the European Union, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is the world's biggest economy. And it is causing problems and tension today, the fact that they are so intertwined. Some countries in Europe are doing much better financially than others, and the ones that are doing much better financially are having to pick up some of the slack of the ones who are not. And one of the reasons that Europe developed so well and became so economically wealthy is because it was advantageous for trade, its site and situation. So its site, meaning that the geography of the place, there's lots of peninsulas and there's lots of rivers. So shipping and trade are really easy in Europe. Europe has lots of navigable rivers. So unlike places in sub-Saharan Africa, which still have rivers, Europe has tons of them where you can travel very far inland. The climate is mild and rainy, as opposed to frozen or snowy or super tropical and hot. So that also helped them kind of gain that economic wealth, as well as their situation, right? They are kind of the center of that land hemisphere. If you look at this globe to the left, this map rather, really the land on the planet is kind of concentrated in a certain area, and Europe is really at the center of that, so they can travel very easily to a lot of places. So this made colonialism easy for them to colonize other countries, as well as trading with other regions. So we're going to talk about the economy of the different subregions, the first being the economy of the north, of the core and the north, excuse me, which are the wealthiest areas. Here's a picture of a shopping mall in Paris, but much more wealth than in the south or in Eastern Europe, although those regions or subregions are very wealthy. They are recent colonizers, so France, England, the Dutch, they colonized a lot of parts of the planet, and they are still receiving wealth from those former colonies for the reasons that we discussed previously. They are post-industrial economies, right? So they were the first to industrialize, and now they have entered into more service industries. This is also where the United States is and is further going. So they tend to be wealthier. They are making less things, more being centers of like banking and technology. Um, there has been recent slow growth in this area. They had the financial crisis in 2008 as the same time of the US, as did pretty much the entire world. And so this slowed down their economic growth. When we look at the sustainability of wealthy countries, high populations plus high consumption equal environmental problems. Just how the US has difficulties with consumption, that we're using too many natural resources, that we have a very, very large ecological footprint. The same is true for Europe. They have responded a little differently. They tax pollution quite high. They also have subsidized alternative energy sources, and by subsidized, it means that the government is giving incentives, whether that's tax or financial based, for people to invest in things like solar, as well as wind energy. Um, that's Germany at the top, and then Denmark. Germany has clouds a decent portion of the time, but you can still get quite a bit of solar energy from there. The other thing that they've done is made fossil fuels much more expensive. right? So through a variety of taxes and through not subsidizing them as much. So this looks kind of cheap, 140, not cheap rather, but expensive, right? This is gas per liter, right? Very, very, very expensive. The economy of Eastern Europe. So after World War II, everything kind of behind the Iron Curtain, which was controlled predominantly by the USSR. Yugoslavia was communist but independent. So the USSR um, was in charge of reconstructing after World War II, and so they rapidly industrialized, but there was a lot of repression and mismanagement. So before the Iron Curtain fell, Western Europe was much wealthier than Eastern Europe due to that mismanagement and repression. So during the Cold War, from 1945 to 1990, there's very little trade across that Iron Curtain. Eastern Europe is mostly trading within Eastern Europe. After the collapse of the USSR and that communist regime, there was a bunch of foreign investment in Eastern Europe because wages and costs were lower over there. So it was seen as a great place to go and manufacture stuff. So they had rapid, rapid growth after the fall, but they are still behind the most of Western Europe, but they had a ton of economic growth in the meantime. So a good example of that is Germany. Germany used to be divided into two countries, West Germany, which was the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, which is the German Democratic Republic, which was not really a democratic republic, but a communist country. Berlin, which is in the middle of East Germany, was actually divided into. And so it was split in half by this Iron Curtain after World War II. It was reunited in 1990. Um, and so much like the rest of Western Europe, Western Germany had deindustrialized and been in heading to more of a service economy right there. And then in the East, now there's been a ton of industrialization. So cheaper labor, more manufacturing, cars being made there like BMW and Volkswagen. And so this is good for the overall economy of Germany. It's one of the reasons why Germany has this very strong economy because it has a mix of this manufacturing in the East and service industries in the West. Um, and so, such as export, they really have the ability to export their goods and as well loan money. Southern Europe was slower to industrialize and quicker to deindustrialize, so it kind of left all of these people behind. It was also the center of the financial crisis, not just Southern Europe, but also Ireland and Iceland. You can see here an unemployment line in Greece and an abandoned factory that's been turned into a park in Italy. So lots of unemployment in Southern Europe. They've gotten loans and bailouts from the rest of the EU. This is part of what's led to that tension. Um, and so when we look at unemployment by country in the European Union, Germany has the lowest, which they're not even on, they don't even fit on the scale, but they have 4.8% at the time of this. And Greece at the time had 25%. Also, Spain, which is considered part of that southern region, 22% unemployment. And so we can see scenes from the financial crisis. Ireland, while not technically part of that sub-region, is economically very similar. So we have these ghost estates in Ireland, things that were being built, but then the economy collapsed, and now they're completely empty. And then we see a bank run in Cyprus. So in the United States, after the Great Depression, the federal government now insures. It used to be $125,000, now it's $250,000 of your money in the bank. And so when banks start to collapse in other countries that don't have that, people start running to the bank to try to get their money. And also when we talk about that GDP growth, right? So we're looking at GDP growth here. Red countries have grown a lot. The economy of blue countries has actually shrank. So we look at Southern Europe, lots of shrinking of the economy. We see that in Ireland. We see that growth of the economy, especially in Eastern Europe, when all of that investment opened up after the collapse of the Iron Curtain. We're going to talk a little bit about social justice and the welfare state. So In much of Europe, there is high taxation, but lots of social programs. So having big social programs, big benefits for the average person are quite normal. So even when they have higher unemployment, they have less poverty because there is this social safety net that works very well. Um, but what happens when the money runs out? So when Greece was having their big kind of economic problem and they were getting bailouts from the EU, part of the conditions of those bailouts were something called austerity measures. And so austerity measures mean that I'm going to borrow this money in order to pay it back. I'm going to cut back on my social programs. I'm going to cut back on my investments in my own country in order to make these payments. It's, a tightening of the purse strings. Um, and so these are very, very unpopular in European countries because they have just this, this cultural idea that we have big social programs and we take care of people when things are bad. Greece had a lot of protests over this, but generally speaking, and we'll see this around the world, when countries have to borrow money, then they have to cut back on their own programs, and then this can also lead to more financial problems. So they're very, very unpopular, these austerity measures in Europe. The last thing we're going to talk about is the European Union. So the European Union is an economic organization. It is not political, which a lot of people get confused about. Many people think that somehow they are politically entwined together, but they're not. It's basically this economic organization, and the goal was easier trade, right? So when the United States makes a trade agreement, they make it with the EU. They don't have to make individual trade agreements with every small country in Europe. They have a common currency called the euro, which is used by most countries, not all. England never adopted the euro. The members of EU give power to make individual economic policy. This is also kind of linked Eastern and Western Europe together, which can be good and bad, right? It can be good for Eastern Europe because there's a lot of investment that's coming in, but some people in Western Europe see it as a negative because you have people coming from Eastern Europe looking to work in Western Europe. So problems in one part can affect the other, such as the EU having to bail out Greece can have effects on the rest of the EU. I want you to notice the countries that belong to the EU, the absence of Switzerland. Switzerland has kind of always done its own thing. There's plenty of countries in there that have applied to the EU and haven't gotten in. Turkey had applied several times to get in and has not made it into the EU. The Eurozone is a group of states or countries that are using the euro. So again, some opted out, including the UK wanted to keep their own currency. Some are obliged to join later. It's one less trade barrier, right? So when we're trading goods across countries, we're using this one common currency. We don't have to worry about it. The value of it has been very volatile lately. Especially after you can see when the euro got kind of into play, it was down. It used to be just about even with the dollar, and then it got much more valuable. Then the economic collapse happened, then it blipped, and so the currency is kind of up and down. There's questions about the future viability of all of these countries using the same currency because it really kind of have an effect on their country's value. What you're going to do is you're going to watch a video after this. This is the last slide for this lecture on Brexit, which is a vote that the UK had to leave the European Union. There was a lot of kind of nationalist movements in England that are happening right now. And so they decided that they voted, and the vote was pretty close. Most of Scotland voted to remain. Lots of parts of Ireland voted to remain, but many people voted to leave. Um, and this has led to initially financial chaos. It's now stabilized. It's a 2-year process to leave, and those negotiations are not going very well. Northern Ireland is kind of this weird example because Ireland and Northern Ireland is part of the UK, Ireland is an independent nation, and so since that they were both part of the EU, you could cross that border quite easily. And so now, if the UK is not going to be part of the EU, the question is, will Northern Ireland vote for independence so that they can remain in the EU? Same with Scotland. Scotland might vote for independence again. They had voted recently before this Brexit vote. Um, and they chose to stay narrowly as part of the UK. But again, they may want to stay as part of the EU. So the negotiations for the UK to leave the EU are very complicated, and it seems as though the English government was not really prepared for this, and this video will explain that. And a lot of people who voted to leave the European Union just didn't really have a good concept of what it was. The number one Google search after the vote was, "What is the European Union?" So we're going to watch that video. You're going to do a short assignment on Brexit, and then you're going to proceed on to your first exam.